The Illinois Central Passenger House. The name and the heart of Mendota was decided by the survey of the Illinois Central Railroad around 1853. The second railroad, named the Chicago and Aurora, laid their tracks to this spot too and crossed the Central Railroad, and that's where the junction would be. The Illinois Central Passenger House and Freight House was being built in 1853 at this junction. The Illinois Central Railroad tracks were in by summer's end of 1853, and shortly after the CNA, or Chicago and Aurora, later named the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy, or CB&Q for short, they made it to town a couple months later. So the junction in Mendota was there. Mendota, an Indian name, was thus born, meaning crossing of paths or connection. Now people could go places on what they would refer as the magic carpet ride. Yes, that's what it was referred to as. The Central Railroad came right up the middle of the state and opened it up to hope, dreams, aspirations, livelihoods, economic prosperity. The sky was the limit. Immigrants from all over came to America and became successful. People could travel quickly, and the railroad laid the way for them and was ready for them. They considered it a magic carpet ride. In an 1856 advertisement from the Illinois Central, it mentions, quote, "And accommodations for the traveling public, we have large and commodious hotels having been erected at Cairo, Centralia, Wapella, Mendota, Amboy, and Dunleith." That's in page 74 of Mainline of Mid-America by Carleton Corliss. Another line reads, quote, "The Illinois Central maintained eating houses at Champaign, Mattoon, Centralia, Decatur, and Mendota." That's on page 72. When passenger trains stopped in Mendota, the passengers could get on the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad, original the CNA, and they operated from 1853 to 1858 before the CB&Q took them over. And those passengers could go on to Chicago. Travelers on the Illinois Central Railroad from southern Illinois towns such as Cairo, Jonesboro, Centralia, Carbondale, Bloomington, Decatur, El Paso, LaSalle, to name a few of the bigger towns, could continue to Galena, Illinois' largest city at the time, of 12,000 people, and also a lead mining mecca. Or they could divert from Mendota to Chicago, a fast-growing town due to the Illinois and Michigan Canal and the new railroads coming into that community. From Mendota to Galena were mainly the towns of Amboy, Dixon, and Freeport. Dunleith, or East Dubuque, was further west of Galena and at the Mississippi River. The Illinois Central connected the upper Mississippi with the lower Mississippi and Ohio River. It couldn't fail or freeze over in the winter. The early years, such as 1859, was a time of wood plank sidewalks and depot platforms and dirt roads. 6 years of eliminating prairie grasslands carved out a growing Mendota around the junction. The 3-story brick Illinois Central Passenger House / depot was located in the area where the Mendota Railroad Museum's CB&Q 4978 steam engine is displayed, and it ended about where the Illinois Central Freight House stands just in that area. As mentioned above, it was a hotel and an eating house besides a depot. In the early days of the telegraph communication system using Morse code, the trainmen on the passenger trains would take the orders of travelers ahead of time and relay the messages to the telegraph office and relay them to the restaurant personnel, and the food would be prepared and a hot plate was ready upon arrival. A 30-minute stop was allowed for passengers to eat in the large dining room. The Illinois Central Telegraph Company was in operation by 1855, when the first timetable number 1 was issued. It was probably located on the south side of the passenger house, either in it or the building next to it on the south side. The water tower for the railroad was on the north side, in line with Jefferson Street. Telegraph communications concerning train statuses and other related information had to be relayed first and foremost before any orders for food. The Illinois Central Passenger House had about approximately 16 to 20 rooms, I'm guessing, and waiting rooms, a baggage room, and possibly some sleeping rooms for railroad or hotel personnel. A man by the name of Mr. Penton was assigned as first agent and had a designated office room in the passenger house. The beautiful light-colored brick structure also had an ornate octagon-shaped tower that overlooked the town of Mendota, which in 1859 had a population of 3,000 when Abe Lincoln stopped here. The growing community had 40 businesses, 6 schools, and 7 hotels, and 700 houses in 1859. In 1850, just 9 years earlier, the population was a big fat 0. Before the Central Railroad got there in 1853, it was maybe a handful of settlers in the groves throughout the prairie, maybe. The rapid growth was due to the Illinois Central Railroad. The same was true of other towns all along the surveyed route through central Illinois. When the railroad surveyed the area in the spring of 1853 and decided this is where the junction is going to be in this vast wide open prairie, a man by the name of Mr. Giles from Homer, or Troy Grove, Illinois, erected a general store, which was the very first structure basically in Mendota. He built it opposite of the big passenger house, and all of the construction workers of the passenger house, freight house, and other structures, they bought their food and clothing and all kinds of supplies from the general store on what the railroad would designate Main Street when Mr. Blackstone laid the town out. My wild guess is that, ironically, the Main Street Bar and Grill is probably the spot of the old general store, or pretty darn close to it. If you are in that bar looking out the front window and in between both sets of tracks of the Burlington Today and the old Illinois Central main line of Mid-America, that is where the passenger house once stood. And that's where Abe Lincoln got off the train. The commodious passenger house would serve the traveling public from 1853 to 1885, 32 years before disaster struck at 2:30 a.m. in the frigid minus 16-degree morning of February 20th, 1885. A fire caused by an exploding kerosene lamp hanging in the baggage room quickly engulfed the room and its contents. The large brick building acted like an oven and incinerated the heavy lumber which held up the floors and ceilings and crashed down, and bringing down 98% of the brick walls as shown in this photograph of after the fire. A new depot was needed quickly, but it would take time. After they leveled the passenger house, the new Union Depot was built north of the burn site and all the way up to 8th Street. Construction began in spring of 1885, and the depot was finished in 1888. An HO scale model of that depot is inside the museum, and a huge mural of it just one block west of the depot. I want people to know about the first original passenger house, and that is why I did my painting, to bring it back to life and share the history and importance of it with you all. It was erected when Mendota was born and when prairies were all that was here. In 2023, while digging some holes about 3 feet deep for a railroad signpost, we discovered remnants from the ashy soil from that fire so long ago. Also, in early 2000, I found a cream-colored brick from the passenger house buried 3 feet deep. Because of the depth and location of that brick, I believe it to be from the passenger house from 1853. Some of these remnants are on the HO scale layout in the depot in the southwest corner by that little lake I had made. We also found glass bits, perhaps from the windows, and a lamp of some sort, so you can see the relics that we gathered at the depot. In 1858 and 1859, Abe Lincoln stopped here. So did Wild Bill Hickok. He was here too. He was from Homer, or Troy Grove, Illinois. His dad had a business there in Troy Grove. Stephen A. Douglas was here, and Lincoln's wife, Mary Todd, and 2 of his kids, from the records we've researched, they were here. And many other important figures in history. A lot of figures slipped through Mendota, unnoticed and noticed. Across the 2 tracks from the passenger house on the southwest side was the Illinois Central Freight House, built the same year in 1853, and it is the oldest brick structure in Mendota. In the painting, you see it in the foreground. It had a wooden dock around the entire structure to allow freight goods to be exchanged with the trains and horse-drawn wagons operated by draymen. It's astonishing that the building still stands. Walk around it and see if you can spot relics from the old telegraph lines. I did not too long ago. There are 2 wood wedges with a wood dowel in each of them to screw in an insulator. Those are very old. North of the freight house was a large fenced-in park area of landscaped trees and bushes and grass. This area extended over a block and was about 50 feet wide along Main Street to the Illinois Central Railroad tracks. A full-time gardener was hired to keep the area neat and trim. I imagine passengers could step off for some time for some fresh air and walk around the park on a hot day underneath the shaded trees. A photo from 1898 of soldiers returning from the Spanish-American War walking by the freight house still shows trees in that area, and very tall at that. So much history has been lost to the fast-moving wheels of time. But if we add up all the clues we mine from books, photographs, online resources, and from the earth, and our best logic, common sense, and reason, then we can put together a picture of the past and do it in living color. I like to jump inside photographs and explore, walk around, take a look with the magnifying glass, see what you can find. We can imagine those times way back and get on a time machine and even put those scenes into models or on canvas to share with other people so they can get on that magic carpet ride or in that time machine and know what our past was like. The painting has been influenced mainly by 4 historic views of the passenger house and from written information from the Tracks of Time book and the Magnificent Whistle Stop. That book is available in the gift shop. And I also have some 5x7 postcards of this painting and a few of my other paintings available. Also, I discovered important information about the Abe Lincoln trips during the 1858 debates and the 1859 inspection tour covering the entire IC railroad system. The passenger house and Abe Lincoln. Abe Lincoln stopped here. Lincoln and officials assess all 705 miles of Illinois Central property on a 9-day trip, including Mendota, in mid-July of 1859. The Illinois Central passenger house was only 5 years old when Abe was here on business on July 14th. Could have been 15th, but I'm leaning more toward the 14th of 1859. The special 9-day trip called the State Auditor Assessment Tour of the Illinois Central Railroad. The Illinois Central Railroad was being sued by the state for back taxes from 1857. The state officials valued the Illinois Central Railroad property and land at $19,711,559.59, and the railroad valued it at about $4,942,000. Abe Lincoln, a lawyer, defended the Illinois Central Railroad, but his longtime friend, good friend, Jesse K. Du Bois, the state auditor, was working for the state of Illinois. Ironically, Abe had suggested to Jesse to join the Republican Party and get the state auditor position. They were good and longtime friends, dating back to the 1830s. To help solve the tax matters of years 1857 and 59 through 59, they arranged a special trip to inspect and assess for tax evaluation the entire 705.5 miles of the railroad, which of course included Mendota. They would get off at every terminal station along the line and assess and inspect the value of the trackage, buildings, freight houses, depots, passenger houses, water towers, etc. Lincoln was the host of the trip. He brought along his wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, and 2 of his boys, Willie and Tad. Common sense, logic, and reason tell us that we as humans, we get hungry. The Illinois Central Railroad had a restaurant in the passenger house in Mendota, which they boasted about. The closest one south of Mendota was at Decatur, where they may have eaten breakfast or lunch. I'm guessing breakfast. They left for the trip from Springfield on the Western Railroad, traveling about 39 miles to Decatur to get on the main line of the Illinois Central. One must assume they started out early, around the 5:01 sunrise, to beat the very warm July summer days that they were experiencing at that time. Stopping at Decatur about 39 miles away, the special steam engine and one private car with the railroad and state officials began their work. They could only travel in daylight hours because they needed to examine and inspect and appraise every mile and any and all railroad property of the Illinois Central. Therefore, it is obvious that after working, eating breakfast, and departing Decatur, they headed northward to all the other stops on the timetable and eventually reached LaSalle, where they crossed the magnificent bridge in which they were most likely impressed and perhaps stopped on it to inspect and assess its value too. I could see that. When they made their way into the yard, they seen the depot, the freight house, the coal tower, water tower, engine house. You could also see the bridge from the yard with a clear, unobstructed view, and it perhaps would have been a very most impressive sight on the line, the crossing of the Illinois River. They all got out and did the same routine of inspection. I am sure Lincoln's boys, along with his wife, got off the train and stretched and got some fresh air. They did have a little park area also near the depot, kind of similar to Mendota's passenger house. Keep in mind it was a very hot July, with temperatures ranging from 98 to 108 as recorded. No air conditioning in the railroad cars, just a bucket of cold ice water with tin cups. LaSalle was also a designated telegraph office, according to the timetables. It is a strong possibility that before arriving LaSalle, the meal orders were taken by the trainmen. LaSalle didn't have a designated Illinois Central Railroad eating house. While at the Illinois Central Telegraph Company's office, the orders were relayed to the Mendota Telegraph office and then taken to the restaurant, kitchen most likely. And according to written records, by the time they reached Mendota, about 30 minutes later, a hot plate of food awaited them, where they usually had about 30 minutes to eat. But since this was a special train with Jesse K. Du Bois, the auditor, and Abe Lincoln, the lawyer, extra time was given to complete their official duties. I would guess at least an hour or two. This was an important junction, closest point to Chicago on this line. The Illinois Central was very proud of their passenger house, which was a hotel and eating house. The passengers took advantage of the modern convenience the railroad provided. I can envision Abe on this trip getting off the train with his wife and kids and the many officials of the railroad and state. They wandered about the property, and quite possibly the kids made it to the park across the tracks, where numerous trees provided shade on that sweltering day. At this important junction in Mendota, the state auditor Jesse K. Du Bois and his team, plus lawyer Lincoln, walked about the property with papers and writing utensils in hand, inspecting and assessing the passenger house, freight house, the interlocking tower, water tower, telegraph office, the trackage, and all else considered railroad property. Since the passenger house was a hotel, we have no records if Abe stayed here or at Amboy. or Dixon that night. We do know Lincoln stayed at the Nechusa house and Dixon several times during his travels. I have a hunch Dixon is where they possibly ended up on that summer night of July 15, 1859, because he arrived in nearby Freeport on the 16th. The night of the 14th remains a mystery. Could Mendota have been where they stayed? I don't know. It was basically halfway between Springfield and Freeport. One thing we do know is he stopped in Mendota on official business on this 9-day assessment tour. Let me add another important fact here. Abe Lincoln and Stephen A. Douglas stopped here in Mendota, not on the same trains, but they both stopped here while on their way to and from the Senate debates in Freeport on August 26th and the 28th, 1858, about a year earlier. When Lincoln lost that Senate race, it was his friend Jesse Du Bois, the state auditor, who was disgruntled with the Illinois Central for favoritism shown to Stephen Douglas by the railroad. George McClellan, the chief engineer and vice president of the railroad, let Douglas use his private car with sleeping quarters and dining room all along the debate trail, while Lincoln traveled in coach seats. A day after that Senate seat loss, Jesse Du Bois filed the lawsuit for back taxes due by the Illinois Central, the largest corporation in Illinois. The railroad still owed Lincoln payment of $4,700 for the McLean County case he won, and he ended up filing a suit against the railroad for non-payment. Du Bois wanted Abe to join him in the state's case against the railroad, but the IC Railroad wanted Abe on their side since he was the best lawyer around, and thus made arrangements with Abe that he would be paid. Lincoln eventually won the case for the IC Railroad on November 18th and 19th, months after the 9-day auditor inspection tour in July of 1859. The case was litigated in Mount Vernon, Illinois, where today there is a historic marker that mentions the case and states it kept the Illinois Central Railroad from financial peril and bankruptcy. The case of whether Abe Lincoln stopped here in Mendota is quite obvious. On July 14th or 15th, he, along with state auditor Jesse Du Bois and officials, had to get out and appropriate and appraise all the property. Not only was he here, but the record shows his wife Mary Todd and two of their boys, Willie and Tad, were here. But the mystery remains as to where he stayed overnight. My wild guess is they made it to Amboy before the sun set, and either stayed there or went on to Dixon a little further up the rails and stayed at the Nechusa house, which still stands and operates as a old folks home right now. The guest book of that Nechusa house had Lincoln's signature in it a few times, according to Harry Schaller, a museum friend and pioneer of the Mendota Railroad Museum. He's seen Abe's signature in the guest book at the Nechusa house back in the 1930s when on a Cub Scout trip. The guest book's whereabouts are a mystery yet to be solved. That would answer if he and family stayed there that night of July 15th, 1859. Records indicate the train rolled into Freeport on the next day of the 16th. The state auditor inspection trip would take them onward to Galena and to Dunleith or East Dubuque, and then crossing the river by ferry to Dubuque, Iowa, where they stayed at the Julian House. The railroad bridge crossing the river would not be completed until 1868. Over the course of the 9 days, they would head east to Chicago via the Galena and Chicago Union Railroad from Freeport to Chicago. That's what I'm guessing. That was the railroad used. Or they could have came back down to Mendota and headed east to Chicago. But anyway, they headed over to Chicago and then headed, after they stayed in Chicago, they headed south on the branch line all the way to Centralia in Cairo, Illinois. They made it back after that 705-mile trip. They made it back to Springfield on July 22nd, 1859. It's hard to believe that the following year, in November 1860, the IC Railroad lawyer was elected as President of the United States of America and served from 1861 to 1865. The Illinois Central Railroad was strongly supported by Abe Lincoln and Stephen A. Douglas, despite their rivalry. We need to celebrate the first and original Illinois Central Railroad passenger house, where Lincoln was a few times during 1858 and 59, and possibly more in years prior. With this painting, I have depicted that day of July 14th of 1859, with Lincoln and officials on the platform and doing their inspecting and auditing with Jesse Du Bois. Also, Abe's wife and kids, Willie and Tad, can be seen on the wood platform of the Illinois Central Passenger House, a place where they most likely ate in the restaurant too, and perhaps enjoyed a stroll through the park across the tracks and got a friendly wave from the full-time gardener. I thank you for listening to this little slice of history, and please visit the Mendota Railroad Museum, and you'll see a lot of Illinois Central history and Chicago and Burlington and Quincy Railroad history. Thank you. I would like to demonstrate how I went about doing this painting of the Illinois Central Passenger House in Mendota. First of all, I made an enlargement, got it printed up, and then basically I cut it out and then traced it, the windows and the outline of the building, so I would get it as accurate as I could. So I'm going to show you. Okay, this is the Illinois Central Freight House over here, and this is the passenger house, and this is the dock of the freight house. I did cut out, well actually no, this was the end of the photograph, the picture, the enlargement. Okay, and so I know what the Illinois Central Freight House looks like. The rest of it, there's plenty of pictures, and plus it still exists, being built in 1853 and finished in 1854. So it's awesome that you can still go in it and have a nice meal at the Mexican restaurant. But anyway, I'm going to take this off so you can see that is how I went about it. And this was part of the dock here. As you can see, there was a horse there and a dray wagon here, but I took it out from there and I put it here. And anyway, that's how I did it. This fence here actually went here, line it up right. Yeah, right there. Of course, that dray wagon was over here. But anyway, that's how I did that.